So James, you lead the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration, and you're also the author of a study on the impact of public attitudes to migration on the political environment in the Euro-Mediterranean region. Can you tell us a bit about the main findings of your studies?
Yeah, so we've been working with the ICMPD for, I think, nearly 2 years now. We're currently working on our second report, which has 3 chapters. The first report looked at attitudes to migration across Europe and the southern partner countries, which is what the ICMPD calls the southern and eastern Mediterranean countries. And we looked at how attitudes have changed over the last few decades, what they are, why they've changed, both from a theoretical and literature point of view, but also from our own data, and also how they affect voting. And that's really where we've gone in this current report. The first chapter came out before the last European Parliament elections that looked at Europe, and we showed that despite the fact that attitudes to migration and immigration in particular are becoming more positive, somewhat counterintuitively, or what you might not expect, people are voting for the radical right more, or at least they've begun to more in the last 10 or 15 years. And we show that it's not really to do with people's underlying attitudes or their predispositions changing. Those are fairly stable, even becoming more positive over time. Instead, it's to do with those people who have negative attitudes, having those negative attitudes activated by seeing immigration as increasingly important. We call it increasingly salient. And what really happens in that case, as we showed in that report, is that when people change their most important issue, what they see as their most important issue, to immigration, they're also much more likely to change their voting behavior and other forms of political participation as well, but we really focused on the voting. And it's only then that people switch from center-left or center-right parties to the radical right parties, when they're already anti-immigration, and then they suddenly see immigration as the most important political issue, rather than, for example, the economy or health or foreign affairs or something else. That's what we looked at in the last chapter on Europe. We're currently working on, actually we've basically finished working on, and we're about to publish in the next few days, a similar report looking at how attitudes affect policies and politics in the southern partner countries. And so there, it's a slightly different context. The political context is quite different. Also, the nature of migration and the local economies are fairly distinct from Europe, which means that the relationship is also distinct, but there's also similarities as well in terms of, actually, we tend to see increased positivity, even in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, towards migrants. But the nature of migration, the types of migration have changed a lot in recent years. That's seen higher salience in some areas, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, and Libya as well. And so we look at that changing salience also in those countries. Finally, another report which we're going to, or the next chapter I should say, which we're going to start working on over the next few months, moves from description and explanation more to prescription, or more to interventions. So now we know more or less what people's attitudes are, why they change. That's something we can talk about a lot more in this interview. We want to talk about what sort of communication interventions, what government approaches are more likely to be successful in depolarizing the debate, fermenting or enhancing or supporting an evidence-based narrative, and also moving public support towards what we would consider more of an evidence-based, rights-based, law-based, balanced, above all, migration policy.
Okay, so there are 2 key concepts that I think is very important to define. The first one is salience, and the second one is attitudes. Yeah. Can you explain a bit more the difference between the 2 and how these can change?
Yeah, so when it comes to attitudes, we usually think of that as a broad umbrella term. So that can mean all sorts of things that people might think in terms of their preferences, what would they like government policy to be, who should be led in the country, what qualifications they might have, what background they might have, things that people basically want, how they want the world to look, how they want their governments to approach things in particular. Other types of attitudes besides preferences include perceptions, and there's really 2 types of perceptions that we often think of. One is more empirical or objective, so how many migrants do you think there are in your country? This has a factual, correct or incorrect response. But there's also more subjective or value-based perceptions. Do you think migration is good or bad for your country? Do you think do you see or do you perceive migration as good or bad for your economy? And that can mean a number of different things, because good and bad can mean lots of different things to different people. Another type of attitude is salience. It's also, you might want to think of it as priorities. What do you think are the most important issues affecting your country right now? And we know from political psychology, we know from political science, that people base their behaviors, including voting, much more on what they see as very important. Usually the only, let's say, the top 2, 3, 4 issues, that's what they're going to base their behavior on, much more than something that they might have an opinion on, but they say, hey, it's not very important these days. So salience is what you see as important, in short, whereas attitudes are usually for or against something.
So you mentioned the role of emotions. You talked about a very polarized debate. So the question that comes naturally is, do you see any correlation between emotional engagement and the polarization of the migration debate? Do you see any findings in this respect?
Absolutely. So while it's true that the debate, as you say, is polarized, most people aren't actually that polarized. So broadly, in most attitudes, for example, let's say, do you see immigration as good or bad for your economy? There's usually about a third who see it as bad, about a third in the middle, and about maybe even a bit more than a third who see it as good. And we actually see those more positive attitudes on the increase in recent years. Despite that, it's not evenly distributed amongst those people how salient they see the issue is. So people who think immigration is really important tend to are disproportionately likely to see immigration as a bad thing. So instead of having a really divided society, most people are in the middle, and a lot of people don't really care that much. Probably a majority, certainly more recently. But those people who really care are more likely to be really opposed to immigration. And that means that they're louder, and that means that there's more political mobilization directly on the issue amongst the people who are opposed to it.
Danila, you are the project manager of Euromed Migration. Why is it important to invest in research in this field today?
What we have observed actually is that this polarized debate, this situation that James was describing, is leaving basically less margin, so lower margin for policymakers and migration experts to develop sound migration policies and long-term strategies. This, in a framework as the Euromed, which is about dialogue and cooperation among different countries who have different contexts, is becoming a problem. This is why the countries themselves, the participating countries of the Euromed, have identified back in 2015 the narrative of migration as a priority to be addressed within a dialogue and cooperation framework. And since 2 years, maybe 3, we are proactively cooperating with different stakeholders in order to foster a new balanced narrative with the objective of, let's say, creating a public space to discuss migration with a long-term vision.
So what are further actions that could be taken on board to foster this new balanced narrative on migration?
For sure, what we are going to do is to invest more in research. So we have a plan to cooperate also in the future with the OPAM, because what we also have observed during these past years is that we cannot provide recommendations to public communicators and to policymakers about how to communicate migration in a less polarized way and in a more balanced way if we don't know how attitudes to migration are formed in the Euro-Mediterranean region, but also what kind of attitudes we have to deal with. If we don't know what is the context from this perspective, it would be difficult from the point of view of migration experts to propose concrete actions and constructive recommendations to policymakers.
Well, James, in light of what Danila just said, and also following your recommendations that are put forward in your studies, I mean, what are your recommendations for organizations and institutions that are looking into promoting this new balanced narrative on migration?
We put forward 10 recommendations in the most recent chapter, and we're going to produce a lot more in the next chapter of our work with the ICMPD. I mean, I won't name all of the recommendations we go into, but just to give an idea, some of the things we talk about, we draw on the notion of human values, for example. So this is a psychological concept which has been applied a lot to communication science, to political science, to social science. And this is the idea that people vary in what they want from life. Their motivational goals, why they do what they do, why they think what they think, varies in accordance with what they want, what they see as the good life, what they want from society and their governments as well. So we find that, and other academics have found similar, that of 10 or so values, there are 4 which really matter for attitudes to immigration. 1 which makes you more pro-immigration, that's universalism, that's valuing everyone being treated similarly. 6 which don't really matter. And then 3 which tend to make people more opposed to immigration, valuing tradition, valuing conformity, and valuing security. We suggest in our reports and our work with the ICMPD and elsewhere that one of the big problems with communication on migration is that it's been made, that it's of, by, and for people who value universalism very highly. The problem with that is that that really is speaking to your own audience. What effective communication will do, what communication that depolarizes the debate will do, is be value balanced. So think about those people who value tradition, security, conformity. What kind of communication strategies, speaking about migration in those terms, showing that migration can be a good thing for people who value those kind of things in society, as well as the other ones as well as universalist objectives as well. And being honest and frank about the complexities and the nuances of migration. And I mean, we have many recommendations we could go into at the moment, actually, but another one would be, for example, we recommend that communication practitioners think about migration, think about communication in terms of as much balance as possible to promote a balanced narrative, obviously, but that requires thinking about a rights-based approach, but also requires talking about a law-based approach as well. There's usually a trade-off between the two. And again, being open about the trade-offs involved in policy, being open about this is why we chose this policy, these were the alternatives, and these would be the negative effects of those things. So those are just a few of the recommendations that we put forward.
I would like to conclude with one question, and I would like you both to respond. Just citing from your report, I see that among your recommendations, you say there is a need for more detailed data on migration issue salience, not just the salience of immigration, but also particular aspects such as irregular migration. So how can we shift the attention that now has been given to irregular immigration and turn it into a proper, balanced discussion on migration? What are the recommendations from the academic point of view and from the policy point of view?
I mean, there's quite a few from the academic point of view I would start with. The reason we suggest more detailed data on salience, but also other types of attitudes as well, as we say so in other reports, is because we notice quite quickly that people's attitudes to different types of migrants, to different types of migration, vary a lot. What that tells us is that, to use academic language, attitudes to immigration are not unilinear. They're not just singular. If you're pro one type of immigration, you're pro all types of immigration. Actually, people have fairly nuanced attitudes to migration. Unfortunately, most of the data out there still speaks about immigration and migration as if it were a singular, broad phenomenon. The problem with that from an academic and social science point of view is that it becomes harder then to understand what communication strategies are likely to be effective. From a communications point of view, when you talk about migration like that, it means everyone can imagine the best or the worst particular aspects of migration that already fit in with their predispositions, with their prejudices, which means more polarization, which means less middle ground, basically. So we think about nuance in terms of migration communication, but also in terms of data.
Daniela, following James's response, what is Euromed Migration doing to foster this new balanced narrative on migration?
Well, indeed, James pointed out very important issues that we are also tackling not only through the cooperation with OPAM, but also in cooperation with other entities that are part of the stakeholder groups that we address when it comes to sustain and foster a new balanced narrative on migration. One thing that is very important, and I think that this has been already pointed out, is how migration is communicated depends a lot on the terminology that is used. When we speak about immigration, irregular immigration, or migration as a whole, we need to communicate in a way that these concepts are clear to the public. This is mainly the role of academia and migration experts, but also our role is to embed and communicate in a better way to those people who are communicating migration in the first place, public communicators, but also journalists. The approach that we have developed in the Euromed takes into consideration this dimension and also foster partnerships with journalists, media outlets, and public communicators. So I think that there is a long way ahead, but I think we are going into the right direction, also pointing out that this is a problem and collaborating with the right partners.
Daniela, James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.